Hi folks, Lou here, and I'm going to talk about analyzing games. Now, from a game designer's point of view, when you analyze games, they often sound more or less deflated. For example, Dungeons and Dragons, a great game, my favorite game, other than the game of designing games, can be reduced to Dungeons and Dragons is an avatar-based fantasy skirmish game with ways of improving the capabilities of those avatars. That's a brief description of Dungeons and Dragons. And of course, a response to that might be, meh. There's a lot more to a game than that. But when you're reducing it to its base components, that's what you've got. And the same thing happens when you talk about other games. The same thing happens when you talk about novels. Now, Jeffro Johnson said when I originally proposed this, that's a very bleak outlook. You don't see anything else? Well, yes, there's a lot more to see. But when the designer has to break it down to its lowest components, that's what's there. And of course, Jeffro loves Dungeons and Dragons when it's played in his style. But as he says, the game design analysis is indeed kind of bleak. Now, it's not a full analysis, keep in mind, it's just getting down to the base components. And he believes that the base analysis of newer games is usually much worse than the one for D&D. Who knows? Everything can be pinned down and dissected, though in many cases we don't yet know enough to do that. And when it's pinned down and dissected, it's going to sound kind of meh. But as you add more to the analysis, you see more about what happens. For example, my description of Dungeons and Dragons doesn't consider the effect of the game on players. And that makes a big difference. And that's one of the things that makes the game so popular. Of course, other RPGs can be broken down pretty much the same way. And that's one of the things that makes you recognize that RPGs have a lot more in common than they have differences. Now, another commenter, Saul, said all media can be deflated down to some essential aspects. What matters more is the experience that you get from them. In other words, the effect on the players. What makes the experience worthwhile? Often in D&D, it's solving problems that the GM throws at the party. It is enjoyable. If it's enjoyable, then there's a reason for that. And yes, if you try to design games just using that basic analysis, you're not going to get very far. And yet we see that happening in games as games are simplified and turned into 15 minutes and 20 minutes and 30 minutes. They can become bagatelles. They can become something that's not really worth bothering. So we have to keep in mind that there's more than that basic analysis. Nonetheless, when you design a game, you want to have your basic analysis in mind and know and understand it. If you don't understand that, do you understand the game at all? That's the problem that a lot of designers run into. They don't get down to the bottom, to the basics, and then work their way up. Thanks for listening.